around the track. I was really fortunate to present last September on the topic of energy and vitality, and there's some strong links between that presentation and tonight's session as well. So I really appreciate you for the invite, and I appreciate all these beautiful people that have joined us tonight and continue to join us, and I hope that I can serve you all as well as I can. So can everyone see my screen? I just better do a check before we get into it and start answering the question. And please, as we go, drop questions, comments, feedback in the chat. I'd love to see your faces on the screens. It's always nice to get that audience connection and check in as we go. So thank you very much for attending. And just to get us started, if you have any questions or topics that you'd like to cover through the night, drop it in the chat, and Jan and Wendy will orchestrate the session as we go. Thank you, Jan. Yeah, so consciousness. Better just check that these slides are moving along for me, Wendy. Yeah. So I think Wendy's already covered my story. I don't need to go into that anymore, but consciousness itself is possibly the most perplexing question that remains unanswered at this current point in time. And tonight, what I hope to do is present two versions of consciousness. One is the scientific viewpoint and the other is the spiritual viewpoint. And what I hope to do is link that to our own individual performance, growth, and connection. Interestingly, consciousness itself, from a scientific viewpoint, one of the reasons that scientists have struggled to explain this phenomenon of consciousness is because the scientific field operates on reductionistic principles. So that is breaking things down to their lowest common form and running hypotheses to test for outcomes. And that really struggles in a field like consciousness because it's such a big topic and there's so many interrelationships. And that's perhaps why science has failed to explain some of the phenomena that we see in consciousness. I'll start with a little story. The picture you see on the screen is actually my mother and father, and very good looking people at mine and my wife's wedding about 12 years ago now. And the story starts with my mother, and it starts just after I was born, so many, many years ago, when my mother experienced a near-death experience. And as she was laying in the hospital bed, she recalls how it felt when the doctor injected her with heparin. And the procedure went wrong. And what she describes is a phenomenon that many people have described, and it's in the scientific literature and it's in the spiritual texts as well, that in fact humans do have out-of-body experiences. And that was something that my mother experienced that day. She describes a sensation of floating above the hospital bed, looking down at the doctors and nurses as they were frantically bashing an old school blood pressure machine, which was not responding. In fact, her blood pressure had gone so low that it wasn't registering a reading on the machine. She describes seeing things in vivid detail. She describes the paintings dancing on the wall. She describes my father as being totally unaware of what was going on in those circumstances. Yet she was fully aware. She was totally lucid, and all of her senses that we've come to know and rely on to operate in the world were heightened to an extent that she had not experienced when in the physical world in her normal body. And this is just a little scene setter as to where we're going to end up tonight. But it's a story that comes close to home for me, and it's true for many people that have experienced some of these consciousness-related phenomena. So we'll start with the scientific and physical view of consciousness. And I just want to start with the definition because it is quite ethereal. So classic source of all definitions has to be Wikipedia. And Wikipedia describes it as a sentence or awareness of internal or external existence. And some of the characteristics of awareness are knowing, perceiving, thinking, feeling, sensing, accessing intuition, and being wakeful, amongst other things. And please drop in the chat whether this resonates with you or not. But basically, consciousness, as it's defined at the moment, is awareness. Awareness of the self and awareness of others and the context that we're in. So now raising awareness, obviously from a personal perspective and a self perspective, can be very useful in navigating life, whether it's business context, whether it's a relationships context, whether it's self-introspection. Consciousness is at the forefront of all those processes. And each of these different descriptors here can lead to learning. And when learning is combined with memory, we have what we all know as intelligence. So consciousness is not intelligence, but it's very closely related. And I hope that by the end of this session, we've all got some takeaway tips to increase our intelligence, both the intellectual component and the emotional component. So in terms of performance and growth and that learning and memory and intelligence aspect, I've put a picture here of the hierarchy of competence. And I think most of us will probably know something similar to this. In the coaching context, we look at learning models like learn, do, apply, teach as ways to embed memories and encode those memories in our brain so that we move from unconscious incompetence through to unconscious competence. And this is like when you first start driving a car. You know, you generally don't know anything about how the car will operate and perform. But over time, excuse me, I'll just have to cancel that. But over time, you learn from other instructors, you experiment and you iterate and you climb this ladder of competence until basically driving a car becomes second nature. And in fact, you can do other things while you're driving a car, even though it's not illegal. And we should put a medical disclaimer on this call, Wendy, because you know what I'm like. But you all get the drift. We become unconsciously competent at something. And this unconscious competence is not just a function of the mind, and it's not just a function of the brain. It's a function of the whole body as one unit. And we'll unpack that and peel the onion as we go. So consciousness really at its heart is energy, matter, and expression, at least in the physical world that we live in. So the third dimensional reality of time and space and matter, energy and matter really rule the show. And I've put up a metaphor here for us to think about. And the metaphor starts with an acorn. Now, the acorn obviously needs an environment to sustain itself. So the acorn by itself will not be able to fulfill its function on planet Earth without rich soil and nutrients from which to grow. But ultimately, the acorn has an inbuilt innate intelligence that when energy is applied to that situation, the acorn is able to express its genetic code and grow into a magnificent tree. And this is at the heart of all consciousness. In the physical realm, energy and matter and expression according to our genetic code is what gives rise to life and the full expression of life. Does anybody have any questions on the metaphor? I just want to make sure that we're landing so far before we move on. Let me know, Jan, if there's any questions in the chat.
I'll just remind for some of the new participants that have come in, if you want to ask a question, you can go into the participants box down the bottom, find your name, put the little electronic hand up, and we can see it on the screen. That way I can see it on the participants list if you want to ask a question, or you can pop it in the chat box. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, awesome. And I see Sergey's just asked if I could repeat. Is there any specific component of it, Sergey? I think most people have got the metaphor. We can come back to it. So this is a metaphor that's useful. And we'll expand on that now with some other metaphors from the plant kingdom. So we see in the plant kingdom that virtually all plants do not have brain function. and they also don't have a nervous system. But yet plants have this amazing intelligence, and they also have the ability to sense their environment. They have a form of perception that we don't necessarily recognize. And this is really interesting because as humans, and from a scientific perspective, we cannot explain many, many phenomena. You know, the human body is so complex, we still can't explain the entire code of the human body. In fact, when the genome was sequenced, genetics only explains 5 to 7% of human diseases. So we have a long way to go in terms of understanding the world that we live in and understanding the nature of ourselves. But in the context of plants, a couple of really interesting examples. One is the creeping vine. Now, the creeping vine, it doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have a nervous system, yet it manages to grow in direct relation and in direct oneness with its environment. And the reason it can do that is that plant actually has a sensory adaptation that allows it to understand where it is in space relative to other objects. And that enables it to grow effectively with scaffolding. Now, the Venus flytrap is even more bizarre. So the Venus flytrap usually has its trap open. Now, when it rains significantly, the Venus flytrap can sense that and close its trap. When it's windy, it keeps its trap open. And the Venus flytrap is so sensitive to its environment that if a fly or some sort of insect comes within proximity of it, it will only close its trap if 2 of its sensory nodes are triggered by an external animal. Not 1, not 3, but 2. It's a fascinating thing. And on closing, the Venus flytrap secretes a chemical which allows it to break down that animal and sustain its own life. So it's pretty fascinating that even in the plant kingdom, we have all of these senses, much the same as we have in the human world. And so my question for the group is, do we feel as though plants have consciousness? And I'm happy to leave that unanswered. If we go from individual objects to collective consciousness, this has practical applications in the business world and in terms of understanding ourselves as well. So all consciousness has a property called emergence, and emergence occurs when there's more than one player in the system. And ant colonies are a perfect example of the emergence principle. Basically, every ant in a colony takes on one role. So it takes on the role of a worker, a caretaker, a soldier, or a gatherer. And these ants work in unison as a team. Now, if an ant is unfortunately eaten or killed or something happens to it, then what happens is the rest of the ants in that colony will pick up the absence of the chemical scent of that ant. Now, it won't be specifically that ant, but it'll be the balance or the ratio of the number of workers and caretakers and soldiers and gatherers in that colony. And so ants have memory. They have memory of chemical traces. And when they see a deficiency in one of the roles in the group, an ant will change its role in the group and subsume another role for the greater good. And we see this all over the animal kingdom. We see this in the plant kingdom, where one plant will exchange its carbon footprint and exchange its fungal distribution in the soil to support another plant's growth. This exists everywhere, and it exists in human civilization as well. However, interestingly, the Eastern culture is very much oriented to the collective, and the Western culture is very much oriented to the self. And I believe the Western philosophy of consciousness is perhaps more limited than the Eastern philosophy of consciousness. And we all have a lot to learn from each other, and we can grow when we work together as a unit. So, what is the nature of the universe? So we've talked about energy and matter as being fundamental building blocks. And really, the nature of the universe is one of duality and polarity. And I'm not going to attempt to do too much quantum mechanics tonight. And I don't want to lose people at the starting line. But duality and polarity are fairly easy to understand, and these are in the non-quantum world, okay? So this is the physical world that we live in. The physical world that we live in, and the world of energy and matter, is marked by duality and polarity. So imagine a battery. A battery has a positive and negative terminal, and the battery wouldn't function if it only had one terminal. So really, duality is this concept that we have a negative and we have a positive. And those things can be separate in and of themselves, but they cannot work unless they are part of a whole. Does this make sense, this concept?
Yep.
Yeah, sweet. Now, polarity just describes the bridge between positive and negative. So imagine it as being a spirit level. So if we're too far one way, the bubble will shift and we'll be out of balance. And if we're too far the other way, the balance shifts again. This is the nature of all things physical in the universe. And even if you think about our bodies, you hear doctors and naturopaths and coaches like me talk about antioxidants and pro-oxidants. It's exactly the same thing. When you cut an apple and it browns, what you have is a reaction that is driven by positive and negative charge. It exists everywhere in the world. Now, we have a few examples here. And I could have written 30, 40 examples, but I think you get the drift. You can't have life without death. You can't have death without life. Same with light and dark. And as it occurs, same with mind and matter. They are separate things, but must be integrated. And so we move on to the nature of self. And it's important to understand ourselves and how we fit into the universe. So our true nature is also just energy and matter, much like the universe. In fact, we are made of the exact same materials as that of the stars and the sun and the solar system. We're in a slightly different configuration or expression, but we are made of fundamentally the same materials, and we have fundamentally the same properties in a physical sense. So the 6 things that really drive our nature of self are electrical activity, chemical activity. So chemical activity happens, there's millions of reactions in the body every second, facilitated by enzymes. And our chemistry determines our mood and our temperament. You've probably heard of neurotransmitters before. That's our brain chemistry. We also have electrical pulses in our brains that drive our thinking. I think you get the drift. We are magnetic beings. Gravity dictates that we don't typically levitate. We are always anchored to the ground unless we change that through some sort of human invention. So we are also magnetic, and the magnetic forces actually hold our physical matter together. We're thermal creatures. Our body self-regulates its own temperature between 36 and 38 degrees centigrade, but that's an ongoing process. We have thermal mechanisms in our body. And we are physical. We're flesh and bone, and we have a psyche. So we have a sense of ourselves. We have a sense of knowing what it's like to be ourselves, what it's like to be Wendy, what it's like to be Jan, what it's like to be Andrew. But sometimes it's really difficult to convey that to others. We all have our own unique experience and our own unique expression in the world. And so I like to summarize ourselves by saying we are in fact just an intelligent expression of the universe. Does anyone have any questions on the nature of ourself or the universe?
My goodness, that is such a big topic, Andrew. That's unbelievable information. There's some great comments in the chat box. So if anyone's got any questions, ask them now. Oh, Nicole Stafford said she's got so many questions.
Awesome. Well, we will probably save some for the end. And just if there's any questions in terms of the fundamental nature of the universal self, I'm happy to answer them now. Some philosophers would actually say that we don't exist. And what they mean by that is that there's no boundary actually between us and the universe.
Wow.
And we won't get into all of that. I've deliberately left philosophy out, but it's a fascinating topic. Thank you, Sergey.
I think we'll have to give you 2 hours next time. So, Andrew, how do we actually become aware of our reality?
Brilliant. Thank you. And in case anyone was wondering, these are pre-planned questions to a large extent. I love Wendy's facilitation. It's awesome. But I didn't want it to look like that I was a shambles. So our awareness comes from a few places. So in our body, imagine if you touch a hot kettle or a cactus, we have sensory neurons just below our skin, okay? So a lot of people, when we talk about neurons, they think that that's solely a brain phenomenon. Well, in fact, it's totally not. We've got as many or more neurons in our body than we do in our brain. So, I just wanted to bust a little myth there, and we'll unpack why that's important in a minute. But essentially, the sensory neurons underneath our skin communicate via our nervous system, up our spinal cord, and into our brain. And our brain is a receiver. And you'll see in a minute that it's our control center. And our brain chooses how to interpret that. And so, in a sense, our brain's on lag because the stimulus has come from an external event and it's had to be transmitted through your body via your nervous system, okay? Now, obviously, the way that our brain interprets this sensory input is really important. Some people perceive pain via the nociceptors in very different ways to others. And in fact, this phenomenon is so amazing that there's a phenomenon called the phantom limb. And people who lose limbs in an accident report this sensation of feeling as though they still have a physical limb, even though they don't. And this is all related to our brain's perception of our body in space and time. All right? So one way of having consciousness is via our physical body, and that's the mechanism for it. The second way is through our brain, and largely in coaching, and I know we have a fair few coaches on the call tonight, we talk about the NLP model of communication, and it's really centered around the 5 main senses. So sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. And they're huge inputs, there's no doubt about it. But also the inputs from our body in terms of temperature regulation, balance of all the organ function, and our nervous system, proprioception, so the amount of pressure and our orientation in space and time, and also nociception, so our perception of pain, is actually every bit as sensory to the body as these external stimuli. So our body's consciousness is equally as important as our external sensory perception. Now, with the mind, this is a super interesting question, and I'm not going to get into it in too much detail, but the question is your brain your mind? My personal opinion is that our brain is not our mind, and in spiritual circles, the musings are that our mind actually sits outside our body in our energy field. And I'm not going to come down on one side of the fence or the other. I'm not learned enough to do that yet. But what you'll see is our brain is really a receiver and a control center of information. And it actually simulates a lot of what we experience. So we'll move on to that. So what I'd like to ask people, is everyone able to see my screen really well right now?
Lots of people have got their videos off, so hopefully they should still be able to see.
I hope everyone can see the screen. So what I'd like to ask you, and just drop it in the chat, does A and B look a different color to you? The square.
Yes.
Just drop your thoughts in the chat. Yes, 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 yes. Now, many of you may have seen this experiment before. It came out at MIT from the cognitive science department, and it's very fascinating. I want you to take a look at this. On this picture, it's the same picture, but essentially we've drawn a line of continuity between A and B. And in fact, if you look closely, they're absolutely the same color. And so what you're seeing in terms of this slide is a visual trick. This is fundamental to the way your brain works. Square B is in fact the same color as square A. It's just that your brain perceives that this is a checkerboard and that the shadow that's coming from the cylinder is in fact showing us that this is a white square. So your brain is running a simulation that is in fact incorrect. I want to show you another effect that's really enlightening as to our brain. This is called the Troxler effect. And what I'd love everyone to do is just look really intensely at the center of the colors in this picture. And it might take you 15 or 20 seconds, but look intently at the center of the picture. And I'd love for you to drop in the chat after you notice anything. Awesome, Jill. Awesome, Nola. Okay, I do want to keep going and get you through the content. Essentially what happens with this, if you're able to focus long enough at the center of the screen, is that the colors disappear and all you'll see is a gray screen. Why is that? Well, basically the brain has neurons that are constantly sensing the outside world. And the brain has stopped receiving stimuli when you're focusing on that colored picture after just a few short seconds. And what the brain interprets that as is that this image is in fact not a threat. And it's not important for me to see the colors in that picture. So it completely wipes the colors out. And this is fundamental to the way that the brain is architected and therefore the way that we actually see and perceive life. Now, let me know if there's any questions on that. Say again. So Nola, if you saw a completely grey screen, that is the function of your neurons stopping responding to that stimuli because the stimuli is not changing. So the neurons have said, that's not something that I'm interested in. That's not a threat. And so when you think about, what we learn as coaches in the NLP view of the world, this is one of the filters. Our filters are not just our values and our beliefs and that sort of stuff. Our neurons filter out things that are not critical for our survival and performance. My brain is not working. Oh, I think your brain's working pretty well, Jan. So another question just in terms of sensory perception of the environment. I want to ask that age-old philosophical question to the group. If a tree falls in the woods and nobody is there to hear it, does the sound exist? Just drop your answer into the chat. Yes, 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 yes. A lot of yeses. Kristen, you are spot on. Kirsten. Sorry, Kirsten. Yeah, so if a tree falls in the woods, then what happens is there's a displacement of air. From the universe's perspective, that doesn't mean that there's sound. For there to be sound, there's got to be someone to hear it. And for us to hear it, the tiny little cilia in our eardrums need to vibrate at a certain frequency. And that vibration of the cilia in the eardrums is interpreted by the inner ear. And that is decoded into sound by the auditory cortex. So we can take many sides of the debate, philosophical or otherwise. From a scientific perspective, the sound doesn't exist. Now, dogs may be able to hear that sound. Birds may be able to hear that sound. From the perspective of humans, we can't hear that sound. It doesn't exist. So just an interesting tour of sensory perception. Now, what does this all mean? So this is a picture of Thomas Bayes. Thomas Bayes was a famous mathematician and also a priest in England many, many years ago. And he redefined probability. He created Bayesian inference, which is a branch of probability that's widely used in business. And it's very, very, very useful. Now, Bayesian inference, basically, you don't need to know the formula and you don't need to know even what inference is. But essentially, what we're saying here is for you to be aware of something, your brain actually simulates that event. The common myth is that your brain responds. It actually doesn't. It predicts. And this is fundamental to lifting performance. It's night and day. And it predicts that based on prior and posterior probabilities. So your brain will access your bank of experiences, your bank of memories, what you've learnt in order to process the stimulus that it's been given. And it will simulate what it believes is happening. Sometimes incorrectly, sometimes correctly. In fact, if you think about it, there's no such thing as correct because there is no such thing as reality. But anyway, we won't mind Ben too much. So we only process a fraction of the world. And as you saw from the Troxler effect, we stopped processing the colours in that picture. We only process the things that are important to us based on our experiences. And our experiences are coded in our brain by concepts and categories. So we all know intuitively now, at our ages, what a bird is, what an aeroplane is, etc., etc. But when we were kids, we didn't know that. We had to build up the experience. We had to categorize and we had to define concepts around how we label what we see in the world. And let me know if I've lost anyone. And I think it's your next question, Wendy.
I'm trying to keep track of your slides.
Yeah, cool.
So, look, this is amazing. Is there any questions? A zillion of them. And have you lost anybody? Probably, but I think everyone's still loving it. So that's all good. So you've brought up a lot of stuff there about the brain. So what's the relationship that our brain has with our body?
Yeah, cool. Great one. So just to finish off the last session, from the perspective of reality, there is no such thing as one reality. It's every individual's perception of that reality. And it's born out of our memories and experiences. So that's the key takeaway if any of these concepts have been lost. So tying together a few concepts, in particularly our thoughts and our emotions, and our mind and our body. And thanks for the question, Wendy. So your brain is a control center for the body. So when you receive a sensory input, either from the external world or internally from your body, you have a massive release of hormones, neurotransmitters, and neuropeptides. These chemicals are what some call the molecules of emotion. So how we sense make the world and the thoughts that we attach to it drive our emotional state. And if I'm experiencing fear or anger or lust or love or any of the primary emotions, what I'm really experiencing is a cascade of hormones and neurotransmitters and neuropeptides. And there's different mixes of those chemicals that are going around in our body. These are the things that are the subtle differences between genuine love and lust and obsession. And these chemicals drive those subtle nuances in how we experience our emotions. Now, those chemicals are transmitted via our nervous systems and our extracellular fluids in our body. And we have a couple of different nervous systems. We have our central nervous system, which is in our brain and in our spinal cord. And we have our peripheral nervous system, which is in our extremities. And essentially these molecules bind to receptors all over our body. They're like buckets. And when they bind to those receptors, they change the physical shape of our receptors, our cell membranes. And this is how we know that emotions are stored in the body, okay? And why it's so important to feel, to heal, etc. And accordingly, those adaptations also drive an adaptation in our brain. So our neurons and our synapses get rewired and we produce more or less of certain chemicals. And this is how our body reacts to our senses. So in essence, what's going on here in the body is a constant dialogue between the brain and the body. They are inseparable, and our thoughts do drive our emotions. So again, getting back to that principle of duality and polarity, you can't separate the mind and body. And you can't separate yourself from the external world, or the universe, as we were calling it at the start of the session. And interestingly, we have as many communication points in our solar plexus region, which is at the top of our stomach here, as we do in our brain. So in our solar plexus region, we have innervations into our liver, our pancreas, all sorts of different organs to control our body. And fundamentally, the brain simulates its reality on the basis of what's called a body budget. So the brain's goal is to ensure survival and procreation of the species. And so the lens which the brain uses to process its decisions is ultimately at its base a survival process. And if you remember, we talked about temperature, balance, pain, all of those things are going on in your body. Some of them we're aware of, some of them we aren't. And this is the difference between conscious awareness and unconscious processes. And I would purport that the large majority of our subconscious mind is actually in our body. So what's really important with that, and how does it all relate to performance and growth and stuff? So we've got to maintain balance in our body. So remember this concept of duality. We can't be at one extreme or another. And if our body doesn't have enough energy, it will start eating itself from the inside out to get at an energy source. This is what's called catabolism. That's what happens when you're constantly stressed and the stress hormones are flooding the body. Your body breaks down to give you energy to prepare you for a fight. Parasympathetic, on the other hand, is to rest and digest, and that's an anabolic process. And that's how the body grows and repairs. And so what the body's constantly trying to do is manage that balance of growth and repair, and also breaking itself down to renew itself. And so fundamental to our performance and growth is making sure our health is in tip-top order. So this is a quote from me, just to wrap up this section. I know there's a lot of content, and I don't imagine that everyone will walk away with a degree in physiology at the end of this, but essentially just think about your brain is simulating reality, your version of reality, in order to balance its body budget with a goal of survival. And if our bodies are high energy and healthy, we can more easily pursue passions and goals and other goals that aren't purely survival based. And you can see this when someone's sick. You know, they don't want to do some of the things that might bring them joy and happiness. They want to go to bed and sleep and recover their energy levels. It's fundamental to nature.
Andrew, just before we go on, Kirsten has put a question up, and I'm just not quite sure which part it related to. Is this what is meant by the gut brain, i.e. the solar plexus?
Very good. Yes. So the solar plexus has a, well, it's often referred to as the celiac plexus. and it innervates many of our organs in our stomach area. We also have an enteric nervous system, which is the communication method of our microbiome to our central nervous system, so our brain. And I think if we go back a couple of slides, yeah, this vagus nerve here is one of the central channels of communication between the gut and the brain, and it is effectively the mediator of the gut-brain axis. And so many of you will have heard that we have 10 times the number of bacteria in our gut than we do in the rest of our body. Now, those bacteria play a crucial signaling role with our brain, and they produce neurotransmitters and other peptides. So yes, the gut-brain axis is massive to health, and the vagus nerve is what ensures communication happens between the gut and the brain. And the vagus nerve, yeah, it carries blood, it carries neurotransmitters, neuropeptides, all of what we've discussed here. It's effectively the link between the two worlds. Does that answer your question?
Let's just take that as a yes, because this is absolutely fascinating. I'm just conscious I really want to get to everything you've got to share. So obviously this is a big thing about health. So how does our health impact our consciousness?
Yeah. So, you'll know when you're not feeling well, it's very difficult to think well. So intuitively, I think we know this. But there's many things that can go wrong with our health that really impacts our ability to be aware and make good cognitive decisions. So an energy deficiency is absolutely one problem that can happen, and it dramatically impacts our brain and our perception of the world and our consciousness. And also our immune system can have a major impact on our brain. So when they actually dissected Albert Einstein's brain, the biggest thing that they noticed was a difference between his brain and normal brains was the fact that he had a super immune system. And our immune system is really responsible for cleaning out the debris in our brain from the reactions that happen to produce thought and to run the body. So our immune system is super important for our brain function. And if you have an autoimmune condition, that can really compromise your ability to think and be aware of the world. So if you look at conditions like MS, it affects the whole body's ability to regulate its nervous system and to do things like proprioception, so walking and motor activity. So that's an example of how an autoimmune condition can dramatically impact our ability to perceive the world. Nervous system and chemical imbalances. So fundamentally, mental health issues boil down to two things. They boil down to an inflammatory process going on in the brain, and also a chemical imbalance. So the neurotransmitters are a little bit out of balance. And our brain actually requires far more inhibition than it does fuel. So if you look at the way that we're set up, our brain's set up to go at 1,000,000 miles an hour, but chemicals like GABA and serotonin are inhibitory molecules, and they put the brakes on the brain to keep things under control. That's what goes wrong in those sort of conditions. Now, I won't go through all the others, but I will just show people some examples. These are SPECT scans, so they're brain scans. On the left, we have a healthy 80-year-old person, a very healthy brain here. You can see that it's fully formed, which means that blood flow, oxygen, and nutrition is getting to that brain. And on the right here, we see an Alzheimer's patient. Mm. And this is what happens when we get a degenerative condition, and it can happen anywhere in the body. This is just specifically to brain and consciousness. And we all know what happens when people get Alzheimer's or dementia or Parkinson's. So this is an example here. Another example of inflammation in the brain and things that lead to tangling in the brain. If you look at these eggs, in our brain we have a consistency like custard, and it's floating in cerebrospinal fluid. And so basically you've got a hard outer shell of your skull, and you've got the consistency of custard, which is your brain, floating in the middle of it, you can imagine that if you get a head trauma, your brain immediately starts looking like the one on the right here. And so you'll often see traumatic brain injuries that show up on a brain scan like that. Even football players, soccer players that constantly headbutt the ball show significant evidence of traumatic brain injury. So the fundamental thing here is that if you want to retain and build on your consciousness, you have to take care of your brain and your body, and you have to be in peak physical health. And if I can tie two concepts together, people will intuitively know that as we go through life, we get more wisdom. So we get more experiences and memories and learning to draw upon. If we keep our health at the same level, then intuitively our consciousness and our awareness expands. But if our health declines, then that's where our consciousness suffers. So, just in terms of intelligence, so a practical application of all this science, and I know I'm probably going way over time, Wendy, but essentially, I just want to encourage people to think in 4 dimensions. So, or make decisions in 4 dimensions, I should say. One would be thinking, which we all do, day in, day out, and we're overthinkers. Another mode of making decisions is sensations. So people who have addictions will make decisions on the basis of a craving or a drive. And this is an unconscious process that manifests itself in the body and signals to someone to go and do that addiction. But sensations are a useful cue to listen to in the context of a decision. Feeling and intuition. So we know we've got as many neurons in our gut as we do in our brain. So it would make sense that we would want to access our gut feelings to make decisions. And in fact, the science says that people who access their gut intuition to make decisions are far happier about their decisions in the long run. Some decisions need to be made from a logic and rational standpoint and require a thinking cognitive process. Others do not. You know, we know if we're getting into a lift with a dodgy character. Call it a sixth sense, call it what you will. It's a gut feeling and it needs to be listened to. And without optimal health, it's very difficult to listen to the sensations that are going on in your body. Now, just to lift this up to duality and polarity, you'll see the yin-yang symbol there. Thinking and sensations are masculine processes, masculine energy processes. Feeling and intuition are feminine energy processes. And if we've learned anything from the Tao, or the Tao, we should be balancing our yin and our yang, our masculine and our feminine. So when we're making decisions in business and in relationships and in life, access all four quadrants. Cool. So that's a scientific view of what's going on. And if anyone's got any questions, just jump into the chat.
There is one question, but I think we might keep it till the end, just so we can get through your content, and if people can stay on, we can answer questions then. Are you?
Yeah,
cool
awesome.
Right,
so let's go to the spiritual. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So yeah, that was the sort of the next question. What role does our soul and spirituality play in consciousness? Because this is just incredible information.
Thank you. I hope everyone's getting some value out of it. So let's look to ancient wisdom. So spirituality has been around for thousands of years, and you know, I reflect on 2 branches of spirituality, and I mean it in a non-religious sense. I mean it in terms of pure spirituality, but the Tao and the ancient Yoga Sutras are really insightful in terms of spirituality. And what I want to do is attempt to just explain the differences in concepts here from a spiritual perspective. So we all know what the body is. We've covered that in the last session. But if you look at spiritual texts, essentially spirit is effectively source energy. So it's the universe. It's that creation process that is happening all around us. In some cases we can see it, in other cases we can't see it. But this is what's called spirit. It's memory-free consciousness. So we all have memories that generate our consciousness in the world. Spirit is memory free. In other words, it's pure consciousness. It's not filtered and it's not localizable. So it's everywhere and nowhere at the same time, if we get a little quantum. And our soul is essentially the gateway between the physical body and universal spirit. So soul is also not observable, it's immaterial. It's said by some to be the combination of the chakras in the chakra system. But essentially, spiritualists and yogic teachers will say that is in fact where our consciousness sits. It sits in our energy body, which is non-local to our physical body, but it is our interface. And so the brain may receive signals from our soul and our mind. The soul is also said to be the seat of our personality and our free will. Neuroscientists would say it's our neurotransmitters. Spiritualists would say it's our soul. I'm not going to wade into that debate, but I think it's useful to know some of the concepts. Now, we mentioned near-death experiences at the start of the session. There must be something we can learn from near-death experiences in a spiritual sense about consciousness. And in fact, there has been science done on near-death experiences. And there was some amazing science done out of, I think it was the University of Pennsylvania, but they took 1,000 people and interviewed them about their near-death experiences. And the results were incredible. In terms of the experiences that these people had when in a near-death state, was that in terms of their thinking, time slowed down and for some it completely stopped. The sensation of time completely abdicated. And some reported vivid past life memories. And so if you look at spiritual texts, they will say that you carry your soul while you have a physical body on earth. And when you die, your soul rises up into the universe and ultimately is taken on by another vehicle, another person or another animal or whatever the case may be. Now, people report a vivid understanding of their past lives. And there's some fascinating stories that I probably don't have time to go into, but that's what is reported. They also report that thoughts speed up and their life is reviewed in front of their eyes in really quick time. So thinking and our sense of time is totally altered. In terms of emotions, people become completely at peace and experience some of the emotions that we all want to experience in the physical world on a daily basis. And in terms of paranormal experiences, there is a distinct perception of separation from the body and a heightened perception of everything around that person. There's also reports of visions that happen before brain movements on EEG scans. So this is all happening out of the body. Fascinating stuff. And a gentleman from, well, I think he was from Stanford University, John Hagelin. John Hagelin's been investigating this, and I think he's now at the Maharishi School of something or other. But he's been investigating the links between quantum mechanics and consciousness. And his research indicates some striking correlations between what we're coming to understand about quantum mechanics and pure consciousness. And in fact, we experience in the physical world some of these things at the top of the diagram here. So we understand, you know, from nuclear physics, quantum mechanics, atomic physics, we understand that world and we understand above that. And we're only just getting to understand subatomic particles and you know, really dive down into the nature of the underlying reality. This is what's called the unified field. So the unified field is otherwise referred to as creation or the source energy. And there appears to be some striking correlations between the mathematics of consciousness and the mathematics of the quantum world. And many people will know that the duality and polarity that I talked about earlier in the session does not necessarily exist in the quantum world. That is, a particle can have many states at one particular point in time. And so this phenomena is totally plausible, that we wouldn't have a duality in the world in the true sense.
Andrew, I know we've got a bit more content delivered. I'm just conscious of time.
Yep.
And I just want to check in if anybody's got any specific questions that they want to ask, or we'll just keep going for another 5 minutes or so if we can get through the rest.
Yeah, we'll be done.
So, I mean, it's just amazing. I'd be happy to listen for another hour. But there were a couple of questions. So I'm just going to ask Nicole Stafford, are you happy to stay on, Nicole? Because you've got 2 questions so far. But I'd like to get through the content and then ask questions. Can you just take yourself off mute and let me know whether you're okay with staying on? Yes, she's happy to stay. All right. So, a few have said they're happy to stay. So let's keep going and we'll get through it and then we'll have some questions at the end.
Awesome. And what John Hagelin describes is that the yogis that have been able to reach enlightenment or transcendence and access this non-duality state, they've done that through forms of transcendental meditation. Okay. And we do see phenomena such as levitation associated with individuals getting into transcendental states and defying some of the realities of our physical world. So this is a link between some of the things that no doubt we've all seen and thought, well, that's really bizarre. Now, we all know that we have brain states, so gamma, beta, alpha, theta, and delta, and they have different properties in terms of consciousness. All I'm going to say for tonight in the interest of time is that transcendental meditation that is linked to raising your consciousness sits in the alpha range. So it's low alpha, so 8 to 10 hertz. And we can engineer these states. We can engineer these states with neurofeedback and EEG work. Anyone can meditate and practice. Now, clearly it takes practice to be able to do this, but it is possible to get into these altered states. And it's alpha that's the really interesting one in terms of, transcendence. But just for performance and growth in the physical world, every day I have routines that get me from one state to another. So if I want to focus and crank some work out, I will go for gamma. If I want to relax, I'll pick another brain state. And, I have technology and ways to make that transition from one state to another more easy. But it's useful to be aware of these brain states and what outcomes they lead to so that you can consciously choose to lift your consciousness.
So I love that. So I'm hoping that there are, here you go. There are some wonderful models of how we can understand consciousness, because that would be very handy for everyone, I think.
So this is homework, and this is getting right into some deep stuff here. But we all love models, right? Because it helps us interpret the world. A model of consciousness is Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson's model. It's the 8-circuit model of consciousness. And look, whether it's right or not is really not the point. It's a theoretical model. It's a useful way of understanding how to lift your consciousness. And it's similar to the adult growth model that we know in our coaching context, right, for the coaches on the call. But essentially, most people are operating on the first 4 circuits. And these circuits that Timothy Leary described are brain circuits. And so they're all about survival, power, territory, reason and logic, intelligence, and moral codes, being right or wrong. But anyone knows with any debate, there's no such thing as right and wrong. It's all about perspective. And so these are lower states of consciousness. And I don't want to offend anyone that's got, positions on any particular topic. But remember that that concept of duality, nothing good exists at the extremes of any spectrum. And this is intuitively what this model of consciousness is describing. Now, when we go into the top 4 layers of this, these are accessed through, mindfulness, meditation, spiritual healing work, external substances, medical disclaimer ahead, because what those substances do is they magnify the processes going on in your brain. So if you look at people that go to ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru or wherever, what that's doing is the DMT molecule is actually magnifying the processes that are going on in the pineal gland to access altered states of consciousness that are in fact outside your body. And so this is the link between what all these youngsters and others are doing in terms of finding themselves. They're going and accessing altered states of consciousness, which are represented on this model. I'll leave that with everyone as some homework, but it is fascinating stuff. And then I just wanted to wrap with a list of stuff that people can do just on a daily basis or however you choose, just to continue to improve your awareness of yourself and your environment and the context of the universe that you live in. So we've already covered transcendental meditation. That's an obvious. Even if it's not transcendental, any meditation is absolutely useful for accessing parts of your consciousness that you haven't been able to previously access. Spiritual practice of any form, energy work. A lot of the, energy healers and Reiki and emotional freedom techniques and all these body workers and energy workers have largely been shunned for many, many years, but the science is catching up and this stuff works. This stuff absolutely works. Anyone that's been through that process will know the change in themselves. Even sound healing. Shaman from Siberia and Nepal and various other parts of South America, they have a rhythmic drum beat. And that drum beat actually gets you into an altered state of consciousness because of the way the brain works. And if you combine that with some deep breath work, like holotropic breath work, you can access a state equivalent almost to that of taking some external paraphernalia. Lucid dreaming is another way to lift your consciousness. So one of the things that I do, and I don't do it every night, but when I want to lucid dream, I can lucid dream. And to get in that state, I set an intention before I go to bed. I do things like take melatonin, L-tryptophan, and St. John's wort, which are chemicals that are known to help produce small amounts of DMT. In fact, melatonin itself converts to 5-MeO-DMT in the body. And this is the chemical that enables you to access vivid dreams. And you can program your dreams for what you want to dream. I don't have time to go into lucid dreaming and how to do it, but it's available to everyone. Neurofeedback and visualization. Visualization is so interesting because on learning tasks, people that practice repetitively a particular skill learn at a particular rate. And I can't remember what the relativity was. But people that just visualized doing that task in vivid detail had the equivalent performance of a person who was practicing a task regularly. So there is a lot in visualization, even if you are not practicing and learning through physical practice. And there's many more, but I wanted to leave everyone with a shopping list of stuff that you might start experimenting with. Remember that creativity drives growth in the brain. To grow new neurons, there needs to be a stimulus. And trying some of these things, experimenting and seeing what works for you is absolutely a way to raise your awareness and the richness of your life. And that was pretty much it, I think, on the content, Wendy.
Amazing, Andrew. I'm going to actually go to a couple of questions, but we always love a quote to end with, don't we? Keep your vitality. A life without health is like a river. That was actually my overarching key takeaway was health. And I loved how you've brought in those, what I'm going to call, I don't want to, I'm not dumbing it down, but these beautiful things we can do for ourselves where everybody's go, go, go all the time, but to take the time to just be with yourself is so much more powerful. And that's what I took. A lot of those things you've shared at the end there were basically gifts you give to yourself, and and that's sort of keeping it simple. There were a couple of questions. I'm just going to try and find them. So Naroshi had a question. Can you explain the stress and depression affecting the physiology through this? Now, this was way back a little while ago, about 20 minutes ago.
Yeah. So fundamentally, stress depletes our energy, and we talked about how energy was so vital in terms of the body's processes. And if you remember, I think all the way back on the second slide, I don't know whether I can get back there quickly. I think I can. Stress is not just psychological. Here we go. Whoop, too far. Yeah. There's 6 categories of stress, and there they are. So people that sort of think that 5G isn't a problem, love to see the science. We are electrical beings, and any disturbance in the electrical field may have an impact on the way we function. I'm not saying it does, but it may. And so electrical stress is a stress. Chemical stress. So, a lot of us are drinking out of plastic water bottles or drinking tap water. It's got chemicals in it. And, the body's got to process those chemicals. That's a physiological stress. Thermal stress. If you're in a hot or cold environment, your body is using energy to regulate its temperature. Physical stress. If you cut yourself or fall over and, bruise or break something, that is a stress. So there's all these categories of stress. It's not just psychological. But often people think it is psychological. Essentially, the impact, to answer the question, is those levels of stress deplete the resources in your body and make it very difficult for your body to repair. And if you can't repair and grow, then obviously the link is that it's more difficult to have high quality brain function than expanded consciousness.
Andrew, I think that's amazing. I just really loved your content. Unless anyone's got a burning question, I'm just conscious of everybody's time. There are a few questions coming through, but we would end up going on too long, I think. So thank you so much. As I said at the beginning, if anybody who wasn't on, Andrew has got some information he'd like to send to some people as a gift. If you don't want to be contacted, please right now put in the chat box, no contact. And you will be taken off the list. I know who has attended tonight, so if you don't want to be contacted, put no contact. Andrew, I just really want to thank you for sharing your amazing knowledge and taking us so much deeper into the consciousness and how we can actually truly help ourselves with how we can bring more consciousness to our performance and to what we want to achieve in life. So thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for your engagement. Some great comments here, which I'll make sure Andrew gets. Lots of thank yous coming, Andrew. Everyone's loving it, loving the fact that you've shared it. A lot of people are going, too much. One guy dropped out, he said, because I just can't take it in. But it was amazing. It's just taken my whole thinking around our conscious and our unconscious mind to a whole different level. So thank you again. You're very generous with your knowledge and I truly appreciate it. So again, thanks everybody for your comments. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting Coach and Connect in Victoria, and look forward to seeing some or all of you at our next event, which is on the 18th of August. with another incredible speaker who I'll be interviewing. I'm very excited about that. So good night, stay safe, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, Andrew. You're amazing. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Jan.